Standing in the presidential suite of the Pierre, holding a glass of vintage Bollinger that tasted like cold ashes, I realized that my ex-husband hadn't just stolen my fortune, he had stolen my very identity. At 59, I was no longer Margot Vance, the woman who had curated some of the most prestigious art auctions in Manhattan. I was simply the former wife, a shadow draped in champagne-colored silk, standing in a room that cost more per night than my current monthly rent in a drafty Brooklyn walk-up. The rain lashed against the windows, blurring the lights of Fifth Avenue into a smear of gold and gray, mirroring the chaotic mess my life had become since Sterling decided that 30 years of marriage was an expiration date. I adjusted the vintage Tiffany & Co. pearl necklace at my throat, the one item Sterling's lawyers hadn't managed to claw back because I'd hidden it in a box of old tax returns. My fingers traced the cold, smooth stones, a stark contrast to the heat of the humiliation rising in my chest. 3 years ago, Sterling had orchestrated a financial coup that would have made a Wall Street raider blush, leaving me with a fraction of our estate, while he moved his 25-year-old fitness influencer, Amber, into our Hamptons mansion. Today was my daughter Beatrice's wedding, and I was expected to play the part of the gracious, invisible mother while Sterling played the benevolent king. A sudden, sharp vibration from my iPhone on the marble vanity made me jump. It was a notification from Instagram. I didn't even have to open it to know what it was. Amber had tagged the wedding location in a post titled 5 Tips for Staying Snatched in a Bridesmaid Dress. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. The woman was currently downstairs in the Grand Ballroom, likely trying to find the best lighting for a reel, while my daughter was hyperventilating over floral arrangements. It was a circus, and I was the aging acrobat who had lost her safety net. I reached for my leather clutch, tucked my MacBook Air into its sleeve, a habit of a woman who never felt truly safe without her work, and took a deep breath. I caught my reflection one last time. The lines around my mouth were deeper than they used to be, but my eyes were still the color of a stormy Atlantic. I smoothed my dress, took a final sip of the champagne, and stepped out into the hallway. The Pierre always smelled of gardenias and old money, a scent that used to mean home but now felt like an indictment. The elevator ride down was a slow torture. When the doors finally hissed open to the lobby, the opulence hit me like a physical blow. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a fractured light over the sea of New York's elite. I saw Sterling almost immediately. He was leaning against a marble pillar, his bespoke tuxedo fitting him with an arrogance that only extreme wealth can buy. He was checking his gold Cartier watch, looking bored, until he saw me. His eyes narrowed, a shark scenting blood in the water. He didn't come over, he simply nodded, a gesture so dismissive it felt like a slap. I turned away, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I nearly collided with a man who was walking briskly toward the concierge. He was tall, with a rugged, architectural handsomeness that felt entirely out of place in this room of polished surfaces. He caught my elbows to steady me, his grip firm and warm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a deep, resonant hum that seemed to ground me instantly. He wasn't looking at me with the pity I'd seen in the eyes of our old friends. He was looking at me as if I were the most interesting thing in the room. "I'm fine," I managed to say, feeling a sudden, unexpected flush creep up my neck. "Just a bit of pre-wedding vertigo." He smiled, and for a second, the crushing weight of Sterling's presence seemed to lift. "Vertigo is just your body's way of telling you the view is changing," he said, his eyes dancing with a quiet, intelligent humor. He didn't let go of my arms immediately, and in that brief silence, I felt a spark of something I thought had died long ago. A sense of being seen, not as a mother or an ex-wife, but as a woman who still had a fire worth stoking. "I'm Silas," he said, releasing my elbows with a lingering gentleness that made my skin tingle beneath the silk. "Silas Thorne. I'm the architect overseeing the restoration of the ballroom wings." Before I could offer my own name, a shadow fell over us, cold and suffocating. Sterling had arrived, his expensive cologne, a scent that used to signify safety, now smelling like a warning. He looked at Silas with a mixture of confusion and the casual disdain he reserved for anyone who actually worked for a living. "Margot," Sterling said, his voice smooth as a polished stone. I see you've already found someone to help you navigate the lobby. I'd have thought you'd be used to the Pierre by now, even if you haven't stepped foot in a 5-star hotel since the settlement. I felt the sting of his words, a calculated reminder of my fallen status. Beside him, Amber was pouting at her iPhone 16 Pro, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen. She was wearing a white Dior cocktail dress that was perilously short and so tight, I wondered if she'd had to be lubricated to get into it. She looked like a high-end ornament, beautiful and entirely hollow. "Oh, stop it, Sterling," Amber chirped, not looking up from her screen. She gave a little shimmy, trying to find her light for an Instagram story. "Margot looks so classic. It's like looking at a vintage film, very Sunset Boulevard." She finally looked at me, a predatory glint in her eyes. "I love the pearls, Margot. My grandmother had a set just like them. She kept them in a shoebox under her bed." A few guests nearby smothered their laughs. I felt the familiar heat of humiliation, that old desire to shrink until I disappeared. But then I felt Silas's presence beside me. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his aura was like a shield. I took a slow breath, remembering the dignity I'd spent decades cultivating. "Vintage is simply another word for enduring, Amber," I said, my voice calm and pitched perfectly for the surrounding crowd to hear. "It requires a certain level of substance to carry off. Some things, no matter how much they cost, tend to look temporary." Amber's mouth popped open, her glossed lips forming a perfect O. Silas let out a soft, appreciative huff of laughter. Sterling's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to me fighting back. For years, I had been the dutiful wife who smoothed over his rough edges. The moment was interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic, clicking sound. Amber had tried to turn on her heel to storm away, but the plush, 3-inch thick carpet of the Pierre lobby had other plans. Her stiletto heel caught in the weave, and for a glorious, undignified second, she flailed like a baby giraffe on ice. Sterling had to grab her waist to keep her from face-planting into a marble urn. Her iPhone skittered across the floor, sliding right to Silas's feet. He picked it up with a smirk, handing it back to a fuming Amber. "Careful," he said. "These floors have a way of tripping up people who aren't looking where they're going." Sterling glared at Silas, then at me. "We have photos to take, Margot. Don't be late. Beatrice wants the family together, God knows why." He steered his fuming trophy wife toward the Grand Ballroom, his shoulders rigid with fury. I stood there, my heart racing, watching them retreat. The victory felt small, but it was mine. I looked up at Silas, who was still watching me with that unreadable, intense expression. "You handled that like a queen," he murmured. "But I suspect the battle has only just begun. You look like you could use some air before the main event. There's a private terrace on the 4th floor that the public doesn't know about." I should have said no. I should have gone straight to my daughter. But the thought of Sterling's suffocating presence made the air in the lobby feel like lead. I nodded, and as we walked toward the private elevators, I caught sight of myself in a mirror. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a woman who was about to break a very long silence. The private elevator ascended with a whisper, a stark contrast to the clinking glasses and forced laughter of the lobby. When the doors opened to the 4th floor terrace, the air changed. It was cool, damp, and smelled of the rain-soaked trees of Central Park just across 5th Avenue. The city's roar was muffled here, reduced to a rhythmic heartbeat that felt more like a lullaby than a threat. Silas led me to a stone balustrade overlooking the park, where the lights of the Upper West Side twinkled like fallen stars in the mist. He didn't speak immediately, and I appreciated that. He seemed to understand that silence wasn't a void to be filled, but a space to be respected. He pulled a slim iPad Pro from his leather portfolio, the screen glowing softly against the twilight. I watched his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked like a man who spent his life thinking about how things were built, about the bones and the soul of a structure. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," I said, my voice barely louder than the wind. "Sterling has a way of turning every room into a courtroom where I'm always the defendant." Silas turned to me, his gaze steady. "In my line of work, we deal with a lot of Sterling types. Men who think they can tear down something historic just because they want a glass tower with no character. They don't understand that the foundation is where the value lies." He stepped a fraction closer, and I felt the warmth radiating from his charcoal suit. "You aren't the defendant, Margot. You're the landmark. They're just the scaffolding that's finally been removed." I laughed, a genuine sound that felt strange in my own throat. "That's a very romantic way to describe a woman who just got told she's a vintage film." "Vintage films are the only ones worth watching," he replied, his voice dropping an octave. "They have shadows, they have subtext. The new stuff is all bright lights and no story." He paused, his eyes tracing the line of my neck where the Tiffany pearls rested. "You have a story, Margot. I can see it in the way you hold yourself. You aren't hiding from the world. You're just waiting for the right light." For a moment, I forgot I was a 59-year-old woman at my daughter's wedding. I forgot about the empty bank account and the bitter settlement. Under his gaze, I felt a flicker of something long dormant, a slow, honeyed heat that didn't care about the calendar. It was a terrifyingly beautiful sensation. I reached out to steady myself, my hand landing on the cold stone of the balustrade, and his hand covered mine. His skin was rougher than Sterling's, the hand of a man who worked with stone and steel, and the contact sent a jolt through me that made my breath hitch. We stood there for a heartbeat too long, the friction between us palpable. The rain had turned into a fine silver mist, clinging to my hair and the silk of my dress. "I should go back," I whispered, though I didn't move. "Beatrice will be looking for me." Silas nodded, his thumb grazing the back of my knuckles before he let go. "Of course. But remember what I said. Don't let them rewrite your history tonight. You're the one with the keys to the building." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy brass key, an old-fashioned one, ornate and beautiful. "Take this. It's for the private library on the mezzanine. If it gets to be too much, go there. It's the only room in this hotel that Sterling hasn't been able to buy his way into." I took the key, the metal still warm from his body. As we walked back to the elevator, the reflection in the brass doors showed a woman who looked different. My cheeks were flushed, and my posture was straighter. Silas pressed the button for the Grand Ballroom, and as the doors slid shut, he leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. "By the way, Margot," he murmured, "Amber's dress isn't Dior. It's a knockoff from a showroom in Jersey. I'd know that stitching anywhere." I burst into a fit of giggles, the kind of girlish, irrepressible laughter I hadn't felt since my 20s. The elevator doors opened to the sound of the wedding march, but for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't afraid of the music. I walked toward the ballroom, the brass key clutched in my palm like a secret weapon, ready to face the man who thought he'd broken me. The Grand Ballroom of the Pierre had been transformed into a dreamscape of white orchids and flickering candlelight, a cathedral of Manhattan excess that cost more than the small museum I used to run. I sat in the front row, the seat of honor that felt more like a seat of judgment. Every time Sterling shifted in his chair across the aisle, his heavy gold Rolex clinked against the mahogany armrest, a rhythmic reminder of the fortune he'd siphoned from our joint accounts. Beside him, Amber was struggling to keep a straight face, her Botox-tightened skin making her look like a startled porcelain doll as she tried to navigate a plate of delicate hors d'oeuvres while maintaining a snatched profile for her followers. When the string quartet began the first notes of a hauntingly beautiful arrangement, the room fell silent. Beatrice appeared at the entrance, a vision in ivory Vera-Wang lace that seemed to float on the air. My breath caught in my throat. She wasn't just my daughter in that moment. She was the culmination of every sacrifice I'd made, every late night I'd worked to ensure she never felt the sting of our family's collapse. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked onto mine, ignoring her father's performative grin. She gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a secret signal we'd shared since she was a little girl. The ceremony was a blur of emotional highs and sharp, stinging lows. Sterling stood up to give his fatherly blessing, his voice booming with a false sincerity that made my skin crawl. He spoke of legacy and family values as if he hadn't spent the last 3 years trying to erase me from both. I caught Silas's eye from across the room. He was standing near the back, leaning against a marble pillar with that same calm, grounding presence. He raised a glass of vintage Chateau Margaux in a silent toast to me, and for the first time in years, the bitterness in my chest felt a little less toxic. Then came the reception, a whirlwind of jazz and expensive perfume. The tension in the room was palpable as the clock neared midnight. It was time for the bouquet toss, a tradition Sterling had insisted on because he thought it would make for a great viral moment for his firm's social media. The single women, mostly Amber's influencer friends and Beatrice's college roommates, gathered on the dance floor, their eyes sparkling with a mix of genuine excitement and calculated thirst for the spotlight. Beatrice stood on the grand staircase, the bouquet of white peonies and lilies of the valley held high above her head. The crowd cheered, iPhones held aloft like tiny digital torches. Sterling was at the bottom of the stairs, laughing loudly, his arm around Amber as they prepared to capture the moment. He whispered something to her, likely a joke about how I'd be the only one not catching anything tonight. Beatrice turned her back to the crowd, the music reaching a crescendo. She made a feinting motion, as if to toss the flowers over her shoulder, and the girls screamed in anticipation. But then, the music stopped abruptly. Beatrice didn't throw the bouquet. Instead, she turned around, her face set in a mask of fierce, quiet determination. She walked slowly down the stairs, the room falling into a confused, buzzing silence. She bypassed the group of eager young women, her silk train hissing softly against the floor. She didn't stop until she reached me, standing by the edge of the fountain. With a smile that was both tender and triumphant, she placed the heavy, fragrant bouquet directly into my hands. "This belongs to the strongest woman I know," she whispered, her voice carrying through the quieted room. "It's time for your new beginning, Mom." The guests gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed off the high ceilings. Sterling's face turned a mottled shade of purple, his benevolent king persona cracking in real time. Amber looked like she'd been slapped with a wet fish, her mouth hanging open as she realized the spotlight had just shifted away from her. As I stood there, stunned, clutching the cool stems of the flowers, I felt something hard and rectangular nestled deep within the center of the bouquet. My heart began to race. It wasn't just a floral arrangement. I looked down and saw the edge of a small, cream-colored envelope tucked between the peonies, sealed with a wax stamp I recognized instantly. It was the crest of the private investigators I'd tried to hire years ago but couldn't afford. I pulled the note out, my fingers trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. I unfolded the paper, and as my eyes scanned the first few lines, the world around me, the music, the murmurs, Sterling's muffled protests, simply vanished. The air in the ballroom felt thick with the scent of lilies and the sour, metallic tang of Sterling's ego. I could see the veins pulsing in his neck, a telltale sign that his carefully curated mask was slipping. He took a step toward me, his hand reaching for the bouquet as if he could simply snatch the moment back and rewrite the narrative. "Give me those flowers, Margot," he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "You're embarrassing Beatrice. You're making a scene in front of the board members." "The scene is mine, Sterling," Beatrice said, her voice like a whip. She stood between us, her Vera Wang gown shimmering under the chandeliers. "And the flowers are hers. Go back to your table. Amber looks like she's about to have a panic attack because her ring light isn't hitting her good side." I didn't wait to see his reaction. I felt the brass key Silas had given me burning a hole in my palm. I turned and walked toward the grand staircase, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I could hear Amber in the background, her voice rising in a shrill, hysterical pitch. But Sterling, the floral arrangement was supposed to be the backdrop for my next Get Ready With Me video. This is literally ruining my brand. A few guests stifled laughs as she stomped her foot, her Jersey showroom heels clacking hollowly on the marble. I slipped through the heavy oak doors of the mezzanine library, the brass key turning in the lock with a satisfying thud. The room was a sanctuary of dark mahogany, leather-bound books, and the faint, comforting scent of expensive tobacco and old paper. On the desk sat a crystal decanter of Macallan 25 and a sleek MacBook Pro, likely left by Silas. I collapsed into a deep velvet chair, my hands finally giving in to the tremors I'd been suppressing. I pulled the cream-colored envelope from the heart of the bouquet. My name was written on the front in Beatrice's sharp, precise hand. Inside was a small, high-speed encrypted flash drive and a handwritten note. "Mom," it began. "Sterling didn't just hide the Hamptons' money. He's been using a shell company called Amber Sky Holdings to drain my grandmother's trust fund, the one meant for my children. He thought I was too busy with the wedding to notice the anomalies in the quarterly reports. He's not just a cheat, Mom. He's a thief who stole from his own blood. Everything you need to bury him is on this drive. I've already sent a copy to Silas's legal contact. Go to the third page of the PDF. Look at the date." I plugged the drive into the MacBook, my eyes scanning the documents. My breath hitched. The date on the first major transfer of funds was 3 days before our 30th anniversary. He had been planning my financial execution while I was picking out a new Mont Blanc pen to gift him for his years of devotion. But there was something else. A folder labeled "The Architect." I clicked it, expecting more legal documents. Instead, a video file opened. It was a recording from a security camera in Sterling's private office at the firm. I saw Sterling sitting at his desk, but he wasn't alone. Amber was there, her Dior knockoff dress hiked up as she sat on his lap, but she wasn't looking at him with love. She was holding his phone, her eyes cold and calculating as she photographed the very documents I was now looking at. The twist hit me like a physical blow. Amber wasn't just the other woman. She was the one who had tipped off Beatrice. She was playing Sterling, waiting for him to marry her so she could burn him down and take the remains. The influencer was a vulture, and Sterling was too blinded by his own vanity to realize he was the carcass. Just as the realization settled in, I heard a soft knock on the door. I froze, my hand hovering over the laptop. The key turned in the lock. It was Silas. He entered the room, his expression a mix of concern and fierce protectiveness. He looked at the screen, then at me. "The FBI is already in the lobby, Margot," he whispered, walking over to stand behind my chair. He placed a warm hand on my shoulder, his thumb grazing the line of my neck. "They aren't here for the wedding cake. Sterling's Amber Sky accounts just triggered a red flag with the SEC. It's over." I looked up at him, the weight of 3 years of silence finally beginning to lift. I felt a sudden, ridiculous urge to laugh. "She's wearing a fake dress, Silas, and she's the one who betrayed him." He smiled, that slow, intelligent smile that made my heart do a dizzying somersault. In New York, the only thing more dangerous than a woman who has lost everything is a woman who is about to get it all back. Are you ready to go back down? The final act is about to begin. Walking back into the Grand Ballroom felt like stepping onto a stage where I finally knew all the lines while the lead actor was still stumbling through a script of lies. I gripped the bouquet of white peonies like a scepter, Silas walking half a step behind me, his presence a silent, rhythmic percussion to my newfound heartbeat. The room had shifted, the air was thick with the kind of electric silence that precedes a lightning strike. Sterling was standing near the tiered wedding cake, a masterpiece of sugar and vanity that cost more than a Mercedes S-Class, trying to salvage his dignity by barking orders at a terrified server. I saw the men before he did. They moved with a clinical, unhurried precision that screamed federal authority. Dark suits, earpieces, and expressions that had seen through much better liars than Sterling Vance. They didn't look like wedding guests. They looked like the end of an era. As they approached the center of the dance floor, the string quartet's music faltered and died, replaced by the collective intake of breath from 300 of Manhattan's elite. Sterling, ever the narcissist, straightened his tuxedo jacket and flashed a patronizing smile. "Gentlemen, if you're looking for the silent auction, it's in the West Wing," he said, his voice booming with a false confidence that made my skin crawl. "This is a private family celebration." One of the men, a tall agent with silvering hair and eyes like flint, didn't smile back. "Sterling Vance?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "We have a warrant for your arrest on multiple counts of securities fraud, money laundering, and the illegal diversion of trust funds through a shell corporation known as Amber Sky Holdings." The color drained from Sterling's face so fast it was as if someone had pulled a plug. He glanced instinctively at Amber, who was standing frozen by the champagne tower. Her reaction was the first bit of dark comedy in the tragedy. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She looked down at her iPhone 16 Pro, her thumbs flying across the screen. "Sterling," she hissed, her voice cutting through the silence. "My account just got a community note. People are saying I'm an accomplice. This is going to destroy my engagement rate." The irony was delicious. The man had sold his soul for a woman who was currently more concerned with her digital analytics than his impending prison sentence. Sterling reached out, his hand trembling as he grasped the edge of the table, his gold Rolex clinking against a crystal glass, a sharp, lonely sound. "Margot," he stammered, his eyes darting to me with a pathetic, desperate hope. "Tell them this is a mistake. You know, I was doing it for the family, for Beatrice." I took a step forward, the light of the chandeliers catching the fire in my eyes. "You weren't doing it for the family, Sterling. You were doing it for the mirror. And Beatrice is the one who turned you in." I looked at Silas, who gave me a nod of pure, unadulterated respect. "The law has a long memory, Sterling. It remembers every dollar you siphoned, and it remembers the wife you thought you could discard like last season's fashion." As the agents moved in to handcuff him, Amber let out a shrill cry. Not for her husband, but because an agent had accidentally stepped on the train of her dress, causing a loud, rhythmic ripping sound. "My dress," she wailed. "Do you know how many sponsorships I needed for this?" One of the younger agents didn't even look up as he secured the zip ties. "It's a knockoff, ma'am. We've been monitoring the showroom in Jersey, where you bought it, with Sterling's embezzled cash." The room erupted into a frenzy of murmurs and the flash of cameras as Sterling was led away, his head bowed, the king of Park Avenue reduced to a common thief in a bespoke suit. I stood there, watching him go, and I felt a strange, cooling sensation in my chest. It wasn't just the satisfaction of justice, it was the feeling of a heavy, rusted door finally swinging open. I turned to Silas, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like the woman who owned the building. The Pierre's Grand Ballroom was no longer a wedding venue. It was a crime scene draped in white silk. Guests were whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting between the empty space where Sterling had stood and the champagne tower that was now vibrating with the tension in the room. Beatrice walked toward me, her veil pushed back, her face a canvas of raw, unfiltered relief. She didn't look like a girl who had just seen her father arrested. She looked like a prisoner who had finally seen the guards walk away. She took my hands, the bouquet still clutched between us, and for a long moment we just breathed. "I'm sorry about the wedding, honey," I whispered, the weight of the night finally pressing down on my shoulders. "Don't be," she replied, a small, weary smile playing on her lips. "This was the best gift I could have given myself. And you." She looked over at Amber, who was currently being escorted toward the side exit by 2 stone-faced security guards. Amber was hysterical, screaming about her brand partnership with a luxury candle company being in jeopardy. It was a pathetic sight, a woman who had built a life on filters and stolen money suddenly facing the high-definition reality of her own choices. "My iPhone!" Amber shrieked as a guard accidentally nudged her arm. "If that screen cracks, I'm suing everyone in this building." I felt a sharp, sudden bark of laughter escape my lips. It was absurd. Silas stepped up beside us, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. It was a grounding touch, a steady pulse in the middle of the storm. "I think the Pierre has had enough drama for one evening," he said, his voice a low, soothing melody. "The press is already gathering outside on 5th Avenue. If you stay, they'll turn you into a headline before the cake is even cut." He was right. I could already see a few guests surreptitiously filming us with their phones, hoping to be the first to sell the footage to a tabloid. I looked at Beatrice, and she nodded. "Go, Mom? I'm going to spend the night in the suite with my husband. We've already called the caterers to pack up the food for a local shelter. The party is over, but our life is just beginning." Silas led me through a service corridor, a labyrinth of white tiles and industrial kitchens that smelled of roasted garlic and expensive detergent. It was the unfiltered version of the Pierre, and I found I liked it much better. We emerged onto a side street, the cool Manhattan air hitting my face like a benediction. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt shimmering like obsidian under the streetlights. "I have my car around the corner," Silas said, pulling a set of keys from his pocket. But if you're up for it, I know a little place on the mezzanine of a nearby gallery that serves the best black coffee in the city. No influencers, no federal agents, just quiet. I looked down at my hands. I was still holding the bouquet. My Tiffany pearls felt light, no longer a chain around my neck but a decoration. I'd like that, I said. I'd like that very much. As we walked toward his Mercedes S-Class, I caught sight of a Starbucks across the street. A group of teenagers was laughing, huddled over an Amazon box they were opening on a bench. They seemed so far removed from the gilded cage I had lived in for 30 years. I realized then that Sterling hadn't just taken my money, he had taken my ability to see the world as it actually was. "You're very quiet," Silas noted as he opened the passenger door for me. "I'm just thinking," I said, sliding into the leather seat that smelled of wood smoke and old books, about how 30 years can disappear in 30 seconds, and how I'm not as sad about it as I thought I'd be. He leaned in, his face inches from mine as he reached across to pull my seatbelt. The proximity was electric, a sudden surge of heat that made my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. 30 years didn't disappear, Margot, he murmured, his eyes locking onto mine. They were just the tuition you paid to get to tonight. And from where I'm sitting, you've graduated with honors. He didn't pull away immediately. He lingered, his gaze moving to my lips before he finally snapped the belt into place. The sound was like a period at the end of a long, difficult sentence. As he pulled out into the light of Fifth Avenue, I felt a strange, budding sense of hope. The note in the bouquet had changed everything, but it was the man sitting next to me who made me feel like everything was exactly what I deserved. The Mercedes glided through the rain-slicked streets of Soho, the interior smelling of expensive leather and the faint, woodsy scent of Silas's cologne. For the first time in 3 years, the sound of a luxury car's engine didn't feel like a countdown to another social performance. We pulled up to a renovated industrial building where the red brick glowed under the amber streetlights. This was a different kind of wealth, the kind that didn't need a gold-plated Rolex to announce itself. Silas's studio was a sprawling loft with soaring ceilings and windows that framed the Manhattan skyline like a living painting. It was filled with architectural models, sketches pinned to the walls, and a large mahogany desk where a MacBook Pro sat next to a stack of blueprints. It was a space of creation, not consumption. I felt like a creature from a different era, draped in my champagne silk and Tiffany pearls, standing amidst the clean lines of his modern life. "I'm a bit overdressed for a coffee date," I said, a small, self-conscious laugh escaping my lips as I looked at the bouquet of peonies I was still clutching like a shield. "You're exactly as you should be," Silas replied, shedding his jacket to reveal the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders. He walked over to a high-end espresso machine that looked more like a piece of sculpture. "Sterling liked things that looked expensive. I like things that have a soul. There's a difference, Margot." He handed me a cup of black coffee in a minimalist ceramic mug. It was hot, bitter, and grounded me better than any glass of Bollinger ever could. As I sat on a low velvet sofa, my dress rustled, a sound that usually meant I was about to be judged by a room full of socialites. But here, with Silas looking at me with that intense, focused curiosity, it felt like music. I set the bouquet on the coffee table, next to a copy of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck that looked well read. As I did, something caught the light among the white petals. I frowned, reaching back into the heart of the flowers. I thought I had taken everything out in the library, but my fingers brushed against a small silver object. It was a locket. A vintage, tarnished silver locket I hadn't seen in 30 years. My breath hitched. My mother had given this to me on the day I married Sterling. He had told me it was tacky and low class compared to the diamonds he would buy me, and I had supposedly lost it during our first move to the Park Avenue penthouse. I opened it with a trembling thumb. Inside was a tiny, grainy photo of me as a young girl, holding my mother's hand. And behind the photo was a second note, folded into a tiny square. It wasn't Beatrice's handwriting. It was a masculine, elegant script I didn't recognize. "Justice is a foundation, but happiness is the structure. Sterling took your past, but he can't have your now. I've been holding this for 20 years, Margot. It's time it went back to its rightful owner." I looked up at Silas, my heart pounding against my ribs. "How?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "How did you have this?" Silas sat on the edge of the table, his knees inches from mine. "Before I was an architect, I was a student working summers at the moving company Sterling hired to pack up your first apartment. I saw him throw this locket into a trash bin in the hallway. He told the movers it was garbage. I couldn't let it go. I didn't know who you were then. I just knew that a woman who kept a photo like that deserved a man who wouldn't throw her memories away." The revelation hit me with the force of a tidal wave. This wasn't a chance meeting. This was a 30-year trajectory. Silas had seen the worst of Sterling long before I had been willing to admit it to myself. "I've followed your career from a distance," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I watched you build that auction house. I watched you become the most elegant woman in New York. And I waited, because a landmark like you don't just happen, you're built through time." He reached out, his hand cupping my cheek. His thumb traced the lines around my eyes, the lines I had tried so hard to hide with expensive creams and lighting. He didn't see age, he saw a masterpiece. I felt a surge of desire so sharp it made me lightheaded. It wasn't just about the justice or the money. It was about being seen, truly seen, by a man who valued the rust as much as the shine. "I'm 59, Silas," I breathed, my heart racing as he leaned in. "And I've always had a preference for the classics," he murmured, his lips a breath away from mine. "They have so much more to teach." The air in the loft was thick, with a tension that felt both ancient and brand new. When Silas finally closed the distance, his kiss didn't taste of the frantic, hollow desperation I had grown accustomed to in my youth. It tasted of patience, of mahogany and rain, and a quiet, terrifying strength. His lips were firm, moving against mine with a slow, deliberate intent that made the 30-year gap between us vanish like mist over the Hudson. I felt the champagne silk of my dress rustle as his hands found the small of my back, pulling me into the heat of him. For a moment, a flash of old insecurity flickered in my mind. The voice of Sterling telling me I was past my prime, that I should be grateful for the scraps of his attention. I pulled back just an inch, my breath coming in shallow hitches. "Silas, I haven't been with anyone else in a very long time. I'm not a 25-year-old girl in a Dior knockoff." He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached up, his fingers gently unpinning the vintage Tiffany pearls from my throat. He set them on the mahogany table with a soft click, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't want a girl, Margot," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in my very bones. "I want the woman who survived the storm. I want the woman who knows the value of what she's giving." He traced the line of my collarbone, his touch lingering on the skin that I had spent years hiding under high necklines and scarves. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever had in this room." He led me toward the large, low-slung bed that looked out over the glittering lights of the Manhattan skyline. The room was bathed in the soft blue-gray glow of the city, a cinematic backdrop for a scene I never thought I'd star in again. As the silk dress pooled at my feet, I felt a sudden, exhilarating sense of nakedness that had nothing to do with the lack of clothes. It was the nakedness of being seen for exactly who I was, the scars, the wisdom, the hunger. The intimacy that followed was a revelation. With Sterling, sex had always been a transaction, a performance of his own prowess. With Silas, it was a conversation. He moved with a reverence that made me feel like a masterpiece being rediscovered. He explored the curve of my hip and the softness of my waist with a fascination that made me realize I had been holding my breath for decades. It wasn't just about the physical act. It was the reclamation of my own body. I felt a surge of vitality, a pulse of pure, unadulterated life that made me feel more powerful at 59 than I ever had at 29. We lay there for a long time afterward, the only sound the distant hum of a taxi on the street below and the rhythmic ticking of a high-end clock on his nightstand. The heavy, Egyptian cotton sheets felt like a cloud against my skin. I reached over and picked up my iPhone, which had been buzzing silently on the floor. There was a notification from a news app. Sterling Vance's assets frozen amidst massive fraud investigation. Ex-wife's maiden name restored to title of Hampton's estate. I felt a small, triumphant smile spread across my face. I looked over at Silas, who was watching me with a quiet smile of his own. He reached over to his MacBook Pro on the bedside table, the screen glowing briefly as he checked a final confirmation from his legal team. "It's official," he said, his voice warm. "You're not just a free woman, Margot. You're a very, very wealthy one. The Hamptons house is back in your name, and Sterling's lawyers are already scrambling to plea deal. He won't be seeing the light of day for a long, long time." I leaned back against the pillows, feeling the weight of the night finally settle into a deep, peaceful exhaustion. A sudden, light-hearted thought occurred to me. I wonder if Amber knows that the prison commissary doesn't carry organic green juice? Silas let out a rich, booming laugh that echoed through the loft. "I suspect she's currently trying to find a filter that makes an orange jumpsuit look like prison chic for her next reel." I giggled, the sound light and free. The drama, the betrayal, the years of quiet suffering, it all felt like a movie I had finally finished watching. I turned on my side, pressing my face into the crook of Silas's neck. I didn't need the champagne, the Pierre, or the Park Avenue penthouse to feel like I belonged. I just needed this moment, this man, and the realization that the best part of my life wasn't a memory. It was the sunrise that was just beginning to touch the edges of the New York sky. 6 months later, the salt-crusted air of the Hamptons felt different. It no longer smelled like a gilded cage, but like a vast, open horizon. I sat on the wraparound porch of the estate that was once again legally mine, watching the morning fog lift off the Atlantic. Beside me, a steaming cup of Starbucks dark roast sat next to my iPad Pro, which was currently displaying the headline I had waited 3 years to see. Sterling Vance sentenced to 15 years for federal financial crimes. His mugshot was a masterpiece of ruined vanity. The bespoke tuxedo replaced by a drab orange jumpsuit, his perfectly coiffed hair now a jagged, thinning mess. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had traded his soul for a shadow, only to have the shadow vanish. The justice was swift and clinical. Sterling's assets, including the offshore accounts Beatrice had unearthed, were liquidated to pay back the trust funds he'd pillaged. As for Amber, the influencer was currently living in a cramped studio in Secaucus, reportedly trying to pivot her brand to prison wife aesthetics while selling her used designer handbags on eBay to pay for her mounting legal fees. I heard she recently went viral for a video where she cried because a discount store wouldn't accept her expired Dior coupons. It was a rhythmic, poetic kind of karma that made me chuckle every time I signed a document with my new Montblanc pen, the one Beatrice had given me to celebrate the reopening of my own independent art consultancy. Life at 59, I realized, was not a slow fade into the background. It was a vibrant, high-definition rebirth. My days were no longer spent managing Sterling's ego or fending off the predatory stares of Manhattan's elite. Instead, they were filled with the quiet, focused energy of work I loved and the grounding presence of Silas. He had moved his main studio to a renovated barn on the property, and the sound of his architectural sketches being pinned to the wall was the new soundtrack of my life. I reached for my Kindle, catching a few lines from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, but my focus drifted to the silver Mercedes S-Class, pulling into the driveway. Silas stepped out, looking ruggedly handsome in a simple linen shirt and jeans, carrying an Amazon box and a bouquet of fresh, wild lavender. He walked up the steps and pressed a lingering, warm kiss to my forehead before handing me the box. "A little something for the new office," he murmured, his eyes crinkling with that intelligent, protective heat I had grown to crave. Inside was a sleek, minimalist desk clock and a framed copy of the original note Beatrice had hidden in the bouquet. We didn't talk about the age gap anymore. It was irrelevant in the face of a connection that felt as sturdy as the bedrock of the city itself. That afternoon, Beatrice and her husband joined us for a quiet lunch on the lawn. We toasted with a bottle of Chateau Margaux, the wine tasting of red fruits and hard-won peace. There was no performance, no cameras, no viral moments, just the authentic, messy, beautiful reality of a family that had survived the fire and come out stronger. I looked at the three of them, my brilliant daughter, her kind husband, and the man who had seen the landmark in me when I felt like a ruin, and I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated gratitude. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of violet and gold, I walked down to the water's edge. I thought about the woman I was on that rainy night at the Pierre, the ghost in champagne silk who thought her story was over. She was gone. In her place was someone who knew that happiness wasn't a destination, but a structure you built every single day with the people you loved. I took a deep breath, the salt air filling my lungs, and for the first time in my life, I didn't just feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was finally, gloriously home. The first snow of the season began to fall over the Hamptons just as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the world into a hushed, silvery landscape. Inside the house, the fireplace crackled with a steady, comforting warmth, the scent of cedar and pine filling the room. I sat on the deep velvet sofa, my feet tucked under a cashmere throw, a Kindle resting forgotten in my lap as I watched the flakes dance against the glass. For so many years, winter had felt like a metaphor for my life, cold, barren, and something to be endured. But tonight, it felt like a fresh white page. Silas was across the room, illuminated by the soft glow of his MacBook Pro as he put the finishing touches on a project. He looked up, catching my gaze, and the smile that touched his lips was the kind of warmth that no fire could replicate. He stood up, walked over, and sat beside me, pulling me into the crook of his arm. I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. It was a heart that didn't want anything from me other than my presence. My iPhone buzzed on the coffee table, a FaceTime call from Beatrice. She was laughing, her face radiant as she showed me the nursery she and her husband were setting up. There was no shadow of the past in her eyes anymore, no fear of the man who had tried to dim her light. When we hung up, I looked down at the silver locket Silas had returned to me, now polished and hanging on a delicate new chain. I used to think that at 59, I was a finished book, the final chapters already written in the ink of regret. I was wrong. The note in the bouquet hadn't just exposed a crime. It had broken a spell. It taught me that time isn't an enemy that steals our beauty. It's the master architect that gives us the strength to stand tall. As Silas reached over to dim the lights, leaving us in the golden glow of the embers, I realized that the most beautiful thing about a new beginning is that it doesn't care how long you waited for it to arrive. I closed my eyes, safe and loved, finally understanding that the best years of my life weren't behind me. They were right here, breathing softly in the dark.